On January 10th, 2018, the latest build of YuMeNikki was added to Steam, credited under publishers Playism and Kadokawa. Starting the same day and continuing into the following weeks, Kadokawa began teasing and marketing a new project, a whole new game with a completely new style, named YuMeNikki Dream Diary. It was a 3D reimagining done by a small team, developed, quote, under the direct supervision of and with full cooperation from the original creator, Kikiyama, and it would be released a short couple weeks later, on the 23rd of February. This was, by some metrics, the moment of most attention for YuMeNikki. Although the original game has been and remains a staple of internet culture for as long as I can remember, the combination of an official release on a major platform, a lot of marketing, and the biggest pieces of news in over a decade was certainly a huge deal. Needless to say, expectations were high. It would be inaccurate to say that Dream Diary is only remembered today as a disappointment, because truly it's barely remembered at all. It feels like every few weeks, someone new, or someone old yet again, has spent many hours of their life creating their own grand expression of appreciation for the original YuMeNikki. I barely even need to relate its acclaim, especially considering I've already made a video on it, but I think it's important in establishing this stark contrast in reputation between the two titles. One of the first reviews for Dream Diary was by Adam Smith of Rock Paper Shotgun, who wrote that Dream Diary, quote, lost almost all the mysterious horror and charm of YuMeNikki. This sentiment is one most characteristic of Dream Diary's deception, I think. To YuMeNikki fans, it wasn't just not quite as good, it was boring, the paragon of mediocrity, an insult to the original. Not worth being talked about except in contrast to YuMeNikki, the game it literally shared a name with. One of my first questions before I'd even played the game was, why? Not just why does it have such a poor reputation, but also why was it made the way it was in the first place? The first thought I arrive at when thinking of Dream Diary is the mechanical premise. I can't speak for anyone but myself, but I imagine hearing this game described as a 3D puzzle platformer for the first time probably evokes immediate antipathy in most YuMeNikki fans. Maybe they couldn't put the specifics into words, but it's very easy to grasp the feeling that YuMeNikki is special and unique because it lacks any of the identifiable features of genre one might see in any other type of game. YuMeNikki isn't Mario, it's not Zelda, and it's not Half-Life. And that's precisely why it's great. I noticed that most YuMeNikki fan games, and certainly all of the big popular ones, stick very closely to the source material in this regard. And seeing what these talented fans have made, it's not from lack of creativity or capacity. So it seems there's a common feeling that even if something new wouldn't completely change the identity of the experience, it might distract from it regardless. Despite this, my first thought was that it could work. On paper. I thought about this from many angles. In many ways, navigation and traversal go hand in hand. If you're exploring a space, you need a way to get around it, even if it's the most obvious and basic form of movement possible for the medium. Rather than breaking or distracting from that main element, it could just be another way to get from place to place. This sort of thing could also allow for variety in level design. Instead of the two-axis form of all YuMeNikki levels, there could be an exploration of vertical space, rooms above rooms, objects haphazardly stacked atop one another, whatever fits with the particular setting, as long as it seems natural enough. Having that thought also elucidates the decision to make the game 3D. This should allow for a much more natural inclusion of a third axis than the conditional verticality containing perhaps noticeable trade-offs necessary with strict 2D. The only downside would be if it comes across as particularly artificial, if it's too gamey to be authentically YuMeNikki. The puzzle aspect, though, was much more obviously an issue to me. In a sense, there are puzzles in YuMeNikki in that there are some points that require an effect to activate or progress, but, very importantly, they manage to maintain the particular feeling of non-deliberacy that YuMeNikki evokes. They all seem like plausible features of their own weird worlds, and there are no hints that clarify these moments as being puzzles. And the effects on their own don't feel like arbitrary keys as much as random self-justifying gimmicks. This is one area where it feels too easy to fall out of the vibe. You'll want everything to look natural and unique, but it can't be too difficult or unreadable, lest you frustrate the player or halt their progress. Having some consistent mechanical language across at least some puzzles could help avoid this, but then it becomes too gamey. but if you make everything too obvious, then it's just boring. You have to hit a perfect Goldilocks zone, and it's hard to imagine achieving that every time you try over a long enough period. And ultimately, I would discover, Dream Diary didn't really stick the landing on either issue. Rarely, if ever, can you jump or climb onto anything in the open areas, effectively locking you to two axes. This isn't even to mention the times the game literally locks you into a side-scrolling section, which sometimes feels fitting, but often is like a lock from the wider world. There are some sections that are specifically designed for platforming, and I think most of them are just uninspiring with how restrictive and artificial they feel. The one exception would be the block world, which is perhaps the most infamously frustrating section of the entire game. The original block world evoked a contrast of randomness so arbitrary that it seemed natural, with structures so geometrically perfect that they could only be man-made. And Dream Diary carries that feeling mechanically with how janky it is. I saw the trailer and the person playing fucked up a section that also took me forever, so I'm assuming this is intentional rather than a hilarious mistake. The puzzle side of things doesn't hold up much better, with many failing to hit the sweet spot. Some do, however. There's a whole area centered around getting items for a picture match puzzle, which sort of spells out how a significant amount of them miss the mark. If such moments were few and far between, you could at least say, well, it's not perfect, but it mostly works out right. Instead, it seems it's really earned that puzzle platformer distinction. There's a bit of a different outlook you can have if you move beyond the highly visible genre description, though. Let's talk about effects, one of the centerpieces of YuMeNikki. In the original, there were roughly 24 collectible effects, some with special uses, but a lot basically just for fun. In Dream Diary, there's only about 7, those remaining relegated to just the most obviously practical items, a lantern for light, a knife to kill, etc. In exchange, they can be toggled at a press of their own unique button and have some expanded capabilities, allowing for a bit more dynamism and less menuing. Admittedly, in retrospect, the menu necessity in YuMeNikki kinda breaks from the immersion of the experience, though with the higher item count, it might have been unwieldy to have a designated input for blonde hair or fat. While I would have appreciated some more effects in Dream Diary if for nothing but allowing Madon'tsuki some visual variety, this comes across as a good evolution of the whole idea. In exchange, though, there's a lot of one-off item puzzles that show up in Dream Diary which don't really excite me, and very unfortunately bring the menus back into things a bit. I noted before that in YuMeNikki you can't really die. The only equivalent to a fail state is the Tori Ningen, teleporting you to inescapable areas. It was a very clever way to go about it, punishing but not too hard to recover from. This doesn't exist in Dream Diary, and instead there's a much more traditional system where if you fall or get hurt, you die and respawn at whatever the nearest invisible checkpoint spot was. I don't think this is entirely a loss, though it definitely sacrifices some of the original's unique texture. First of all, this game's long, winding ways forward might have been a bit bothersome to run back through if you'd been forced to start over too many times. At least with this system, the player is more responsible if they don't explore hard enough. Second of all, there's some use it gets as a narrative mechanic, demarcating what is a dangerous or disruptive force being represented in Madon'tsuki's dreams. Let me give an example. In the Shotengai, 2 main obstacles threaten Madon'tsuki: eyeballs that roll around dealing chip damage, and the alley demons who can hurt Madon'tsuki if she falls in their gaze for longer than a moment. These creatures, alongside the relatively grounded depiction of some Japanese city's dark alley, manages to craft a consistent and comprehensible idea of Madon'tsuki's character. She doesn't like being looked at, and she fears going outside will lead to drawing the gaze of others. I get the feeling that the developers assumed this was the first area you'd check out, seeing as this is one of the 2 pathways that require no effects found outside. So I think they're trying to give a strong first impression, to express as immediately and clearly as possible that there are multifaceted and complex reasons why Madon'tsuki is a hikikomori. Though at the time, I didn't really internalize the intended imagery, because a more important thought was forming in my brain. There was an idea that I wanted to get at in my YuMeNikki video, and I'll try to summarize it here. The original YuMeNikki uses ambiguity as a tool to its fullest extent, weaving something I truly believe to be an intentionally indecipherable narrative. This is a strength in that it's difficult to dislike whatever story you form in your own head. However, you may end up disagreeing with the premise if you prefer a more exclusive type of story, one that takes a bold stance that you can respect even if others disagree. This probably isn't the most common opinion, and it's hard to attribute the attitude fully to YuMeNikki considering its otherwise extremely abrasive and respectable mechanical construction. Nonetheless, I think this may exemplify the fan attitude towards Dream Diary. It's a lot less ambiguous. Within YuMeNikki, the imagery and events you can witness all seem so random, disconnected, with no hierarchy of importance and no Rosetta Stone as a guide for analysis. There are many differences with Dream Diary, but the first that comes to mind is that there are a lot more elements that interact with reality, or with the endings. The second is that a few visuals and characters show up more than once, to the extent where you can build up a pretty clean through line for them. Let's talk about Monoe, who is a pretty consistent presence in the school area. At the beginning, she'll block the entrance to the school until Rain forces her out, crying, screaming, pushing Madon'tsuki away. When Madon'tsuki shows her the torn picture, she appears to fade away like an appeased spirit. But after sleeping on a nearby bed, a well-established symbol for the player diving into the character's subconscious, she'll be found still wandering in this darker, shattered version of the same school. Finally, after opening a zipper in the wall, she can be found sitting next to a bizarre phallic monster who's rubbing the railing next to her. When Madon'tsuki approaches, the monster rubs faster, and Madon'tsuki has some sort of headache-induced vision before jolting away. If you ask me, I think this is not only clearly a talented application of wordless visual storytelling, but also quite a clever method of reconstituting elements of YuMeNikki to create something concrete. Something terrible happened to Monoe, and the school, in this case possibly meaning a teacher, had something to do with it. The ultimate conclusion is Kyukyu-kun, indicating the nature of the trauma. You also get a lot of Madon'tsuki's perspective. She seems to have known Monoe, but whatever happened caused a rift between them. Maybe Madon'tsuki thought she was helping Monoe move on, only for things to suddenly take a turn for the worse. It's unclear if anything happened to Madon'tsuki directly, but it is clear that the whole situation took a toll on her as well. Quite a few things in this game will force her awake, but this is one of the few areas that can do that in two different ways. But from what I've seen, this is a rather unpopular portion of the game. It's seemingly not because anyone thinks it's some offensive or inaccurate depiction of the subject matter. Now, the non-universal take I've seen is that this is ripping off fan theories. And that really sounds hackish until you realize that there's about 100 YuMeNikki fan theories, and within Dream Diary only a single point of similarity to be drawn. The moment you ask why Monoe, you'll come to realize that Dream Diary and those non-canonical YuMeNikki fan theories are trying to say extremely different things about Madon'tsuki, both in terms of life experiences and mindset. It's not plagiarism to cherry subject matter. I think this criticism is widely adopted because it feels directionally true, that there is something wrong about this in concept, even if there's no meat to the bone of this particular argument. Instead, I think it's another conflict with the nature of the original game. If part of YuMeNikki's appeal is that it's so ambiguous that you can read any sort of subject matter, be it sexual, violent, cultural, political, whatever, then it must also be true that it doesn't have to be any of those things you're uncomfortable with. This is not a convenience that can be afforded to Dream Diary, even if it's difficult to string together a complete narrative picture to the point I haven't seen someone do so. It's too clearly trying to say something for the audience to simply project their own mindscape, or at least they have to color inside the lines. And I think this is only made more of a problem for most people in the fact that it is attached to YuMeNikki. Let me make something clear. The developers never claimed that this game was canon to the original. Some people feel like they implied that, but the developers actually said the exact opposite. Even accepting that, though, I've seen people who will get upset at outside analysis, simply because they disagreed or thought it would make for a bad story. If you're captured by a work of art, you probably have your own reasons aligning with your unique traits as an individual, and sometimes those clash with the reasons of others. In the case of YuMeNikki, it's able to capture a variegated audience due to its ambiguity, allowing many different types of person to project themselves onto it. Thus, when Dream Diary comes along and attaches itself to the brand without maintaining that ambiguity, this is the result. Speaking of, there's more than one type of ambiguity. One of YuMeNikki's greatest assets would be the visual art. Distinctive and often aesthetically pleasing imagery that leaves an impression on the audience. You've probably seen YuMeNikki fans produce fan art numbering in the hundreds or perhaps thousands, even if you haven't gone looking for it. And I don't want to undersell Kikiyama's talent as a visual artist. Making pixel art with such style and readability is no easy feat, especially impressive considering how many permutations of each sprite must exist. But I must give some credit to the nature of the medium itself. The specific texture, and sometimes even the shape of characters and objects, is rendered ambiguous by the simplified and low-fidelity nature of pixel art. We can imagine characters are exaggerated or abstracted, or maybe Madon'tsuki really does have that round of a head. That's all part of the fun. Now, I'm going to temper my words by saying that I think you can still extract whatever benefits exist from 3D while also maintaining visual ambiguity if you simply rely on stylized or low poly 3D. Kinda like in Yeek. Yeek looks really good. It looks visually really good. Unfortunately, Dream Diary opted for a somewhat odd style. I think there's one model that most evidently exemplifies the comparative criticism, and also is the worst looking thing in the game, Madon'tsuki herself. She's quite realistically proportioned and textured, but with some stylized traits, like large eyes. In the abstract, this small young lady basically embodies the traits that almost every artist uses for their depiction of Madon'tsuki, right down to the short skirt. You can't see her legs in the original game. I guess everyone just agrees that it's cute. This design makes a mistake of looking a bit shit. There's a contrast in the realism and stylization that just looks uncanny, and the harshly detailed sweater never looks good up close. Thankfully, I'm able to mentally ignore Madon'tsuki when going out into the different worlds. The lighting and camera work deserves a lot of credit for that, often obscuring or minimizing her to let everything else draw your attention while still giving the necessary visual clarity to tell what she's doing if you're in some precise maneuver. I must also make mention of the fact that Dream Diary has a pretty consistent visual style, which might be more of a downside. YuMeNikki had not just highly detailed areas, but also surreal and simple segments, which served as great contrast. And although Dream Diary does have some of those, few compared to the complete graphical shift YuMeNikki introduced with the mother-inspired segments. I do think there's a lot of places where Dream Diary looks quite nice though. The lighting is pretty consistently good, if there's one thing to single out among whatever else. The use of color, sheer brightness or pitch black darkness in the frequent areas with heavy contrast. It's really good. I especially like when there's some unique effect to make part of a level stand out. As well, some environments and rooms are often colored with various objects, all seeming fairly sensible in placement, making them complex enough to complement the texture quality. Not to say that there isn't the occasional stinker. The whole wilderness section is considerably less pleasant than its original iteration, but that's more the exception than the rule. Though you do also have to fault the game for its somewhat shoddy performance. Admittedly, my computer is a souped up potato, but you'd expect better optimization from a game of this fidelity that came out in 2018. I still can't fucking believe that, by the way. If you asked me a month ago, I would have said, yeah, Dream Diary, that came out in 2014. Like, it didn't? You're telling me this came out in a post-Undertale world? After Lisa, One Shot, and Doki Doki Literature Club? All these huge games inspired by YuMeNikki? And they decided to cross over with fucking Aoni? I know that Kadokawa is involved in some Aoni stuff, so it was probably just the easiest thing to get the rights to. But I'm sure that any of these games would have forked over whatever characters or location Dream Diary wanted for pennies just for a chance to get an official crossover with YuMeNikki. I have heard that Aoni and YuMeNikki have a bit of a tied history, so it's not like it's a completely unfitting inclusion or anything. But Aoni isn't even that good. This may upset some people, but in my opinion, Aoni is underwhelming and unremarkable in almost all aspects, excluding the iconic Oni designs and a scant few moments featuring it. I struggled to comprehend how it managed to stand out and stay relevant even back in the day. That probably makes it funnier though. I almost wish that no one had told me there was Aoni content in the game. I mean, I was positively elated to see that Madon'tsuki had a unique animation for running with the knife. This was laugh out loud funny to me. Can you imagine how I'd have felt discovering Aoni himself was a feature of Madon'tsuki's mindscape? And all the people talking about Aoni made me think it was something big, but really it's just one small area in an admittedly fun minigame. Really well designed actually. This might just be better than the actual Aoni game. With the exception of the item shine being a Mixel's animation, I think this is a solid aesthetic, and it's probably more mechanically interesting than even the original Nasu. It even almost imperceptibly communicates information about Dream Diary's narrative, showcasing Monoe, Monoko, and Poniko. With this, you're less likely to confuse the two nearly identical characters and have some assurance that they all belong to some unspecified category of similarity, possibly Madon'tsuki's friends. The other minigames here hold their own too. Super Nasu feels at least mechanically on par with the original Nasu, though I'd say the original has a much better atmosphere, handily beating the somewhat odd-looking sequel. Is this like a metaphor, or? Majo Adventure then sits squarely in the middle. It's fine, but it's no Zero Ranger. Speaking of which, the music is really good. The OST and sound design are pretty unambiguously regarded as great, somehow escaping the negative feelings put upon the rest of the game. It's to the point where I see music compilations that put YuMeNikki songs together with Dream Diary songs. That must mean they're pretty good. Anyway, for the most part, Dream Diary's reception is easily explained by its attachment to YuMeNikki. YuMeNikki was a near-perfect execution of its premise. Even if you don't completely gel with it, you have to respect the craftsmanship, originality, and dedication on display. Dream Diary, meanwhile, is very unpolished, derivative, and aberrant from YuMeNikki at its very core. This is probably the most obvious conclusion that one can reach after completing Dream Diary, but admittedly, it's also one that hasn't felt complete. Every time I'd look back at the Dream Diary Steam page, I'd see what I gather as being its simplest and most common defense, being laid out by none other than Gustav, the developer behind Cat in the Box and Tied Up. Just don't compare it to YuMeNikki, and it's fine. And it's basically true. I think Dream Diary has some strong points, and as you've seen in this video, most of my criticisms of Dream Diary are contextualized by comparison to the original, something I did completely unconsciously. Every negative review I've seen inescapably uses the word original, but that view ignores the fact that this game is literally called YuMeNikki Dream Diary, that it was marketed as a reimagining of YuMeNikki, that it overwhelmingly draws its imagery from YuMeNikki. How can you take it on its own terms when it practically demands as much as it can that you think about YuMeNikki while playing it? And then I'm sure that's where most analysis would end, with the idea that the developers were just too foolish to realize this obvious fact. They should have known, with the original releasing only a month before for free on the same platform, that everyone who had so much as a passing interest in Dream Diary would have some experience with the original. If only they'd known, they would have made this game completely different. But I think they did know. And although the vibes might be against this little theory of mine, I'd argue it explains a lot of the oddest choices in the game. The most striking example for me would be the Uboa event. In the first place, you can only get to the Pink Sea through one of two paths, which I would argue are both some of the most frustratingly difficult parts of the entire game, testing your skills, mind, and patience all in their own unique ways. And once you get there, it's one of the most unanimously beloved areas in the entire game. The music is great, it looks stunningly beautiful, and the grand scale is used both as a mechanical set piece and also to fit with player expectations. This is the Uboa event, the most iconic thing in the entire game. Of course it's going to be grand. It serves as a stark contrast to what came before, able to crest player expectations from the trough it had created just before. This is then undercut by what follows. Poniko's room is almost comically small and dark in contrast, and then triggering the actual event doesn't actually show Uboa. You just walk into darkness and hear the sound of bone snapping. While this effectively communicates the same narrative suggestions of the original, I find it quite an odd choice in isolation. The Pink Sea beforehand expresses an understanding of Uboa's monumental status and is at least visually a fairly faithful adaptation of the original, which makes Uboa's complete visual divergence an anomaly. The idea that it was just a random, arbitrary choice among many almost bends believability for me, given all this context, to the point where I feel confident in declaring this was done the way it was on purpose. They know you're expecting Uboa, and then they don't show Uboa. On its own, that just sounds like the developers playing an obtuse joke on the audience. But I think its meaning becomes clear when we look at the most important parts of the game, the beginning and the end. The beginning of Dream Diary uses a combination of audience uncertainty and a setting both mundane and realistic to trick the player into believing it takes place in the real world, only shattering the illusion by having Madon'tsuki jolt awake. I think a lot of people must have forgotten this moment despite its effectiveness because it depicts the most important visual, not just in this game but in the original as well, the ending, wherein Madon'tsuki jumps from their balcony and dies. It's probably terrible that this is such a missable moment. Few people will even be equipped to understand your work if you only show the Rosetta Stone of story analysis for a fraction of a second in a one-time event before they've acclimated to the experience. But importantly, this has no meaning if you haven't played the original. Despite neither game being connected by continuity, this moment establishes Dream Diary as not a standalone entry, but as some sort of difficult-to-classify follow-up, a subject which I can't possibly get into right now. Narratively, this opening establishes the state of the story and leads into the eventual conclusions. The two endings of the game are answers to the question of, well, if she only died in a dream, then what would happen next? The normal ending, after a long segment depicting the destruction of Madon'tsuki's apartment and the nexus by the power of some mysterious shadow demon, shows a peaceful day where, instead of jumping from the balcony, Madon'tsuki finally gets to leave her room by just opening the door. It's a fairly hopeful ending if taken at face value, but upon a second watch, I noticed that instead of the memorably lengthy animation of Madon'tsuki getting up from her bed, she simply appears where she was in her dream. This raises the question of if this too is part of the dream, and even her escape was fake. The secret ending, a product of looking for hidden jellyfish, is somehow both less and more conclusive. In this one, after ending up in a memorable area from the original game, Madon'tsuki simply keeps dreaming. She simply gives up. It's somewhat sad for this whole quest to end with stagnation, but this is the only way to have an ending that can't be undercut by revealing it was all a dream, I suppose. The secret ending actually requires what is presumably a second visit to Uboa, this time with the lantern, where it actually sends you to an area resembling Uboa's trap in the original, where you chase around a 3D model of Uboa. This grants an item that allows you to get one of the hidden jellyfish. This alternate ending in the second visit to Uboa was added in an update, which at first confused me. If not seeing Uboa was intentional, then putting Uboa back in after receiving backlash would be walking it back, right? However, on second thought, I see it as somewhat of a clarification of the meaning of the endings, in terms of the intended commentary. On one side, you have a family of symbols, including hunting for secrets, direct replications of YuMeNikki, and staying or diving deeper into the dream world. On the other, there's the straightforward linear path through this game, the more original content of Dream Diary, subverting the imagery of YuMeNikki and destroying then exiting the dream world for good. From recognizing this, I think there are many conclusions you can draw, but one thought that stuck out to me was that it can be interpreted as an argument in defense of Dream Diary's own existence. I remember seeing that the initial plan for this project was a straight-up remake of YuMeNikki in the newest version of RPG Maker. Although we don't have all the information of how they arrived at the decision to make something like Dream Diary instead, I think it's because they came to the conclusion that a simple remake would be a bad idea. I kinda agree, I guess. YuMeNikki is already great, with few aspects you could really change for a remake besides the visuals. And I wouldn't trust anyone to do that besides Kikiyama. But if they're forcing Kikiyama to work, I'd rather they put that effort into something like a new update or something entirely different. And, well, Dream Diary is different, for better or worse. Considering this, at worst I can still sympathize with the developers, and generously I could say I respect it. The sentiment inherited from Kikiyama that you should never explain yourself too much is a bold one, and I feel the game embodies it in the fact that few people ever consider it as having these themes. I suppose that makes sense of the fact that Kikiyama apparently only ever praised the work they saw in Dream Diary. But it's also bold to concretely say something, and Dream Diary does that as well, underneath all the ambiguity and strange symbolism. I can't really say that it perfectly sticks the landing, because a lot of the rest of the game doesn't have the intense thematic focus as the few obviously important segments. Maybe you could justify a lot of it as important narrative conveyance, you know. You need to understand Madon'tsuki's character for the feelings the endings convey to come across, right? But you also have a lot of distracting elements that feel impossible to spin. I mean, like, what does Aoni have to do with this? But I get it, right? For Dream Diary to both revere YuMeNikki, but also testify its value as being something distinct, it feels like quite a contradictory piece. If you're attempting to give a nuanced or even-handed take on a complex topic where people have a high emotional investment, it might be difficult to clarify exactly where you stand. And sometimes the correct opinion is neither the general consensus nor the contrarian stance against it. It's genuinely somewhere in the middle. Putting that into words while trying to be subtle is no easy task. With that said, I think Dream Diary is a fine game, 7 out of 10.